She was my tutor, and every glance, every word, made me forget the rules. She was my tutor and whispered, "Focus, but not too much. I like when you get flustered." I had never imagined that a quiet Tuesday afternoon could feel like a trap I wanted to stay in. The moment I stepped into her apartment, a gentle warmth hit me, not just from the sunlight spilling through the half-closed blinds, but from her. Miss Hartley, or rather Marissa, as I wanted to dare call her, was sitting at her kitchen table, papers spread out, the soft hum of classical music floating around her. She looked up at me with that mild, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that seemed to understand the exact depth of your embarrassment before you even felt it. "Ah, there you are," she said, voice low, velvety, and perfectly calm, though I could swear it had that small tremor of amusement when she looked at me. "I hope you didn't get lost again." I forced a laugh, fumbling with my backpack strap. "No, I found it eventually." Her eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, and I felt my chest tighten. There was something in the tilt of her head, the way a strand of her dark hair caught the light, that made me suddenly aware of how young I was compared to her. She carried herself like someone who had lived, who had made mistakes, who had stories behind every wrinkle near her eyes. But she wore it effortlessly, like it was part of a quiet charm I could never hope to imitate. I took a seat across from her, papers between us, though I couldn't focus on them. The aroma of her coffee, strong, dark, slightly sweet, mixed with the faint lavender from the candle on the counter. I realized I was holding my pen too tightly, tapping it nervously, and she noticed immediately. "You're fidgeting," she said softly, leaning forward slightly. The movement was subtle, but it carried a gravity I couldn't ignore. "Focus, but not too much. I like it when you get flustered." My stomach dropped. The words were casual, almost teasing, but her eyes, God, her eyes, held something that made the air between us feel suddenly heavier. I tried to look down at my notebook, to act like I understood the math problem in front of me, but my hands were shaking slightly, my thoughts scattering across the room. She didn't move, just watched, lips curved like she had all the time in the world, and I was completely trapped in the orbit of her attention. I wanted to say something clever or something flirty, but instead I said, "I'm trying." My voice sounded absurdly small, and I hated myself for it. She leaned back just a fraction, smirk softening into a smile that was warm and dangerous all at once. I can tell. The silence stretched. Not awkward, exactly. More like suspended, like the universe had pressed pause, and I was aware of every slight shift. The brush of her hand against the table, the faint rustle of her papers, the way her gaze dropped to my notebook, then back to my face, lingering just enough to make me swallow. I wanted to reach across the table, to close the gap between her world and mine, but the moment seemed fragile. A whisper of hesitation, a dangerous vulnerability that made me want her all the more. Then, just as my pulse was settling, or racing, I wasn't sure which, the doorbell rang. Sharp, unexpected. My eyes met hers, wide and unguarded for a split second, and in that fleeting look, I thought I saw something unspoken. Curiosity, concern, maybe amusement. And in that heartbeat, I realized I didn't want her to leave. Not ever. The doorbell's echo lingered longer than necessary, but Marissa didn't move to answer it. Instead, she tilted her head toward me, that same quiet knowing in her eyes, and gestured with a slight raise of her hand. "You first?" I hesitated, my thoughts scrambling. I wanted to run, to pretend this was just tutoring and nothing more, but the idea of leaving this room, leaving her, felt unbearable. As I rose, I noticed the faint line at the corner of her lips, the subtle crease in her brow, as if she were holding back a thought she didn't want me to catch. I can get it," I said, voice a little too casual. My fingers fumbled against the doorframe, a small tremor betraying the nervousness I tried to bury. "You always do," she said, and there was again the soft teasing that felt more intimate than it had any right to. The visitor was just a delivery man, package in hand, clipboard in the other. I signed, and when I turned back, Marissa was standing closer than before, sunlight from the window brushing her profile, making her look impossibly alive and real all at once. I wanted to ask questions about her life, her experiences, but every time I tried, I found myself hesitating. There was a quiet dignity about her. Yes, but also a sadness that lingered in the soft slump of her shoulders. A hint, maybe, of regrets she didn't voice. I remembered her telling me once, in passing, that she'd given up a lot for the life she had. Opportunities, relationships, the kind of reckless love that burns fast and leaves ashes. I thought about my own past. Awkward, short-lived flings that never lasted, friendships I'd sabotaged by overthinking, the loneliness I carried around like an invisible coat. And now, here I was, 22, sitting across from a woman who had lived decades more than me, who carried herself with both experience and scars, and my heart wouldn't shut up. "You're quiet," she said suddenly, breaking into my thoughts. Her tone was careful, almost cautious. "I'm thinking," I mumbled, feeling both ridiculous and vulnerable. She nodded slowly, then leaned back, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I like that you think." It was such a simple statement, but the way she said it, it pressed against something tender inside me. I wanted to say more, to admit that I was thinking about her, not algebra or assignments. But the risk hung in the air. The age difference, the boundary between tutor and student, the societal whispers we would provoke if anyone knew. I wasn't supposed to feel this, and yet I couldn't stop. Marissa leaned slightly closer across the table, reaching for a pencil she had dropped, and our fingers brushed. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it carried a weight neither of us acknowledged. I froze for just a heartbeat, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled softly, as if she had just reminded me, and herself, that some moments could be shared in silence, and silence alone could say everything we dared not speak aloud. In that quiet, fleeting connection, I realized something dangerous. I wanted more. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one. I hadn't realized how late it had gotten. The soft, golden light of the afternoon had shifted into the muted glow of early evening, and shadows stretched across Marissa's kitchen like silent witnesses. I was scribbling notes, pretending to focus, but I couldn't stop glancing at her. She was leaning back in her chair, arms crossed loosely, eyes following me with that same quiet, unreadable intensity. "You're distracted," she said, voice soft but firm, and my chest tightened. I'm trying not to be," I admitted, catching myself biting my lip. I could feel my face warming. She didn't press further. Instead, she leaned closer over the table, and suddenly, the distance between us felt absurdly small. The heat from her body seeped through the air, and I became painfully aware of every brush of our sleeves. I wanted to reach out to close that space, but just as I shifted forward, the sound of a key in the lock froze me. My heart leapt. Marissa's head snapped toward the door, and for a split second, I panicked. "Oh, my ex-husband," she muttered, almost too quietly, though I caught the tremor in her voice. "Sometimes comes by to pick up things he forgot." I tried to shrink back into my chair, wishing the floor would swallow me whole. She rose, smoothing her blouse, and moved toward the door with a calm I couldn't feel. I watched her step out of the room, leaving me with the lingering weight of her absence and the pulse in my veins that refused to quiet. I sat frozen, mind racing. What am I doing here? Why do I feel like I'm already too far gone? Marissa returned, a faint, forced smile on her lips. "He's gone. Sorry about that," she said, brushing past me with just enough closeness to make my heart hammer. My hand twitched, wanting to reach, but I kept on my notebook instead. "Don't apologize," I managed, though my voice betrayed me. She tilted her head, eyes softening. "You're nervous," she whispered. "Why?" I wanted to tell her. I wanted to confess everything. The way my stomach tightens when she looks at me, the thoughts I can't stop having, the reckless hope that maybe she feels the same. But I couldn't. The guilt of desire mingled with my awareness of the boundaries, and I stayed silent. She stepped closer, our shoulders nearly touching. The smell of her perfume, faint and warm, made my knees weak. And then it happened. Our hands brushed again. This time, it lingered, subtle but undeniable. I froze. She froze. The moment stretched, taut, and electric, and I felt something break inside me. A longing I couldn't name, a risk I didn't want to take, but one I couldn't resist. Maybe we should, I started, but the words died on my lips, lost in the weight of what we both wanted but couldn't say. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, and for the first time in hours, I saw her hesitate, her walls rising slightly. Whatever the message was, it reminded her, and me, that reality existed outside this room. But the tension remained unbroken between us. I realized, with a dizzying mix of fear and longing, that no matter how careful we tried to be, something had shifted, and there was no going back now. The next evening, I found myself back at her apartment, despite every rational thought screaming I shouldn't be here. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I could feel the tension buzzing between us like a live wire. She was sitting cross-legged on the couch, a book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. Her eyes followed me the second I stepped in, sharp and assessing. "You're late," she said, though there was no anger in her voice, just a faint teasing that made my pulse spike. I lost track of time. I mumbled, shifting awkwardly. Her gaze softened, but only for a moment, before something flickered across her eyes, an edge I hadn't seen before. A shadow of jealousy, maybe, or fear. I couldn't tell which. And suddenly, the small apartment felt too small, every glance and movement charged with electricity. We tried to settle into tutoring, but the math problems felt meaningless. Every time I looked at her, I noticed the subtle movements I hadn't before. The way her fingers tapped against the page, the slight bite of her lower lip when she paused, the way her eyes narrowed just a fraction when I hesitated to answer. And I realized I couldn't hide the way my attention lingered, drawn to her in a way that terrified me. "You're not listening," she said softly, leaning closer. Her face was so close I could see the faint lines around her eyes, the subtle flush on her cheeks. My stomach twisted. I said too quickly, heart hammering. My voice sounded absurd even to me. She let out a small, exasperated laugh and shook her head. "You're lying. I can tell when you lie to me." The honesty in her words cut me in a way I didn't expect. And in that instant, something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold back anymore. "I'm not lying about anything," I blurted, voice low but urgent. I think about you. All the time. I can't stop." Her eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, the room went silent except for the faint tick of the wall clock. Then she leaned back slightly, fingers brushing the edge of her book, as if grounding herself. She started, then stopped, shaking her head. Her lips pressed together, eyes avoiding mine. The vulnerability there made me ache, and I wanted to reach out, to bridge the impossible gap between desire and propriety. But before I could move, there was a sharp knock on the door again. My heart leapt into my throat. She froze, shoulders stiffening, a hand hovering over the door. "It's probably just a neighbor," she murmured, but her voice betrayed a tension that made my pulse race even faster. We both knew it wasn't just a neighbor. We knew that whatever we were dancing around, whatever desire and fear had drawn between us, wasn't meant to exist. And yet, the brush of her hand against mine, the heat in her gaze, and the unspoken confession hanging in the air made it impossible to pretend nothing had changed. The knock came again, insistent this time, and we were frozen, not from fear, from everything else, everything we weren't supposed to admit, everything we wanted but couldn't take. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted her, but I didn't. Not yet. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness I couldn't shake. I kept replaying last night. The brush of her hand, the confession that had almost slipped from my lips, the knock on the door. My thoughts were tangled, restless, like a storm I couldn't control. By the time I arrived at her apartment that afternoon, something felt off. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee, but the air had a stiffness to it, a quiet tension that made my stomach clench. I knocked, but Marissa didn't answer immediately. I stepped inside, calling her name softly. She was standing near the kitchen counter, phone pressed to her ear, brows furrowed, lips tight. I froze, sensing that something had already happened. "I don't care if he's younger." "I can't." "Yes, I know. Just leave it," she said, voice low but sharp. Her hand shook slightly as she hung up, and when she turned to me, her eyes were unreadable. What happened? I asked, though dread had already sunk into my chest. She shook her head, lips pressed together. It doesn't matter, but it did. I could feel the weight of unsaid words pressing down on us. I overheard, she admitted suddenly, voice trembling almost imperceptibly. Your roommate. He came by yesterday while I was leaving your place. He told me about us. The air grew thick. My heart lurched in my chest. What did he say? I whispered, though I already knew it would change everything. She looked away, tracing her finger along the counter. That I'm reckless. That you're too young for this. That people will talk. That. Her voice faltered, and she exhaled sharply, like she was trying to expel the thought before it took root. I felt a surge of guilt, shame, and fear all at once. I hadn't considered the consequences, never truly allowed myself to. And now, standing in front of her, hearing it in her voice, I realized how fragile everything was. I don't care what he thinks, I said quickly, stepping closer. My hand hovered near hers, but I didn't reach out. I want this. I want you. I want you to want me too. Her eyes met mine, flickering with conflict. There was longing, yes, but also restraint, fear, and a hint of anger. You have no idea what you're asking, she whispered. I do, I said, voice low, insistent. And I don't care. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the world outside the apartment fading until there was only us, taut and fragile. Then she moved suddenly, pacing to the window, gripping the sill, gaze lost in the city below. If anyone knew, it wouldn't just be gossip, she said. It could ruin both of us. I can't. She stopped, fingers curling into the curtain, and I felt the desperate pulse of her heart through the tension in her posture. She was afraid, but beneath it was something else, something daring, dangerous, irresistible. I took a cautious step forward. Then we don't tell anyone, I said, voice barely more than a whisper. Just you and me. That's all that matters. She didn't answer immediately. She didn't move toward me either. But the way her shoulders softened ever so slightly, the tiny exhale she released, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head toward me. It was a silent acknowledgement. For a moment, I thought we might finally let go of caution. And then her phone buzzed again. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the shadows of evening creeping in like quiet witnesses. Marissa leaned against the counter, phone clutched loosely in her hand. Her lips were pressed together, jaw tight, but her eyes were soft, vulnerable, and searching. I took a step closer, feeling the pull between us like gravity. My voice was low, urgent. Marissa, we can't keep pretending this doesn't matter. She shook her head, a fragile smile playing at the corner of her lips. We can't, not really. There are consequences. For both of us. I know, I said, swallowing hard. I know it's risky. I know people will judge. I don't care. My hands hovered near hers, trembling slightly. All I care about is you. Right here, right now. Me and you. Her breath hitched. She ran a hand through her hair, fingers brushing her cheek. You're so reckless, she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the longing she couldn't deny. I'd rather be reckless with you than safe with anyone else, I said, stepping closer until the distance between us vanished. I could feel her warmth, the subtle rise and fall of her chest. I wanted to touch her, to close that final inch between us, but fear, hers, mine, the world's, hung in the air like a fragile glass dome. She tilted her head, lips parting slightly, and I saw it. The moment she weighed desire against reason, fear against surrender. I can't promise this won't hurt, she said, voice low. I can't promise I won't overthink it, or doubt it, or let everyone else's judgment creep in. I don't need promises, I whispered. I just need you. For a heartbeat, she froze, eyes locked on mine, and I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the moment where everything changes irreversibly. Her hand brushed mine, not fully, just a fleeting, electric touch that made my chest ache. Then she laughed softly, a nervous, shaky sound. "You're impossible," she said. But it wasn't anger. It was acknowledgement, a quiet surrender. And I want to be impossible with you. My heart pounded. I reached for her hand fully this time, holding it gently. "Then let's be impossible," I said, voice breaking slightly under the weight of everything I'd been holding in. She looked down at our hands, then back up at me, eyes glistening. "Yes," she whispered. A pause, then almost a smile. "But don't think this fixes anything. Not outside this room. We're still complicated." "I know," I said, pressing my forehead against hers lightly, feeling the warmth, the hesitation, the desire. "I don't care. Just this moment is enough." And for a moment, the world shrank to just us, fragile and human and messy, perfect in its imperfection. The phone buzzed again on the counter, reminding us that reality existed outside this bubble. But we ignored it for now. I didn't know what would happen next. There were still risks, judgments, doubts. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wanted her. And somehow, impossibly, she wanted me too. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, painting Marissa's apartment in a warm, golden glow. It smelled faintly of coffee and lavender, comforting and familiar. I was already awake, sitting on the edge of the couch, fingers drumming nervously against my notebook. Marissa appeared in the doorway, holding her mug with both hands, eyes soft and careful. For a moment, we just looked at each other, as if measuring the fragile reality of what had shifted between us. "You made it," she said, voice low, almost teasing, but there was something more in it now. Warmth, acknowledgement, and a hint of surrender. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, voice quiet, yet full of certainty. She walked over, sitting beside me, close but not touching. And then, slowly, she let her hand find mine, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that felt entirely new. No words were necessary. Our touch said everything we hadn't dared to speak aloud. The longing, the recklessness, the vulnerability we had shared over the past week. We spent the morning in a quiet rhythm, sipping coffee, laughing softly at small, trivial things, exchanging glances that lingered too long. Every smile, every pause, every subtle brush of hands carried the weight of what we had chosen, each other, despite the world outside. At some point, Marissa leaned her head on my shoulder. "You know," she murmured, I was terrified. "But I'm glad we didn't run away from this." I tightened my hold gently, heart swelling. "Me too," I said. "We're complicated, but right now, I don't care about anything else. Just us." Her lips curved into a smile, faint and knowing. "Then let's be us. Imperfect, messy, and impossible to ignore." And in that moment, the chaos of the past days, the fear, the almost kisses, the outside interference, all melted into the background. There was only this, two flawed, human souls finding something rare and real. We stayed that way for a long time, simply existing together, letting the quiet intimacy settle around us. The world beyond the apartment still existed, with its risks and judgments, but it felt smaller, distant. The choice had been made, hearts had been opened, and for now, that was enough. As I watched her, sunlight glinting off her hair, I realized that love didn't need to be neat or simple. It only needed honesty, courage, and the willingness to take the leap, even when everything else whispered that you shouldn't. And maybe that's the lesson we carry forward. Love is messy. Love is human. Love is impossible to predict, but worth every risk. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next? If you want to see more emotional, slow-burn romances like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next story.